Thank you for joining this session. It's right at the end of the academic year, after a term that's been very difficult for a whole series of reasons. And thank you for joining the first of our series, Thinking Strategically. The purpose of the series, as we say, is to bring researchers in the subject area to get together to discuss issues of major concern and to ensure that we ensure effective, joined-up action at all levels for the future. I think it's clear that the university environment is changing. The context of research is changing very rapidly, perhaps more rapidly than we might wish. Anyone who's in any doubt of that is going to be very surprised by the changes to postgraduate funding which are afoot. One of the things that is absolutely essential is that a lot of reports are published in our disciplinary area, all of which have great value, but unless they're talked about, acted upon, and followed up with meaningful sector-wide engagement, then they are unlikely to have anything like the effect that they need and deserve. Now, one of the most important initiatives that we've seen very recently is the impressively extensive work of the 3 AHRC Future of Languages Fellows. An initiative that's gathered an enormous amount of people together, and we're here really to discuss the work that Nicola and Katie have put together in their article for Modern Languages Open. So that's the purpose of the seminar and the series. And before we introduce Nicola to say a few words about the article and introduce our panelists, I'll just ask Liz to say a couple of words.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Charles, and thanks everyone for coming. As Charles said, it's been a really, really tricky time, so it's good to see everybody here. I'm here on behalf of UCML, the University Council of Modern Languages. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. UCML, for those of you who don't know, represents the views and opinions of scholars and professionals in modern languages and cognate disciplines to government, the funding councils and other bodies at a national level. We also collect and disseminate information about the state of study, research and teaching languages in the UK. We try to provide also a forum for debate on it of issues that are of concern to members. I think the core of what we try to do in UCML resonates very strongly with the work of ICLS, and so we're absolutely delighted to be working with them in our shared mission to promote the sustainability, but more than that, to promote the vitality of our discipline. And to me, that this article and this session is the first step into really looking at how do we manage that together.
Oh. Thank you, Liz. Yeah, sorry, I have slight problems with my computer, but still things will be fine. So I'd like to say thank you to Kathy here at the Institute for bringing everything together, and to introduce our panel, all of whom are very actively engaged in shaping the disciplinary field in a whole series of ways. Nicola McLelland, clearly will be speaking in just a second. Liam Lewis from the University of Liverpool. Naomi Wells from ILCS. Emanuelle Santos from Birmingham. Becky Muradás-Taylor from Leeds. And Abir Hamdar from Durham. We're going to leave plenty of space, of course, for questions and answers at the end of the session, but do please place any comments in the chat function. But before we begin the conversation, let's just ask Nicola to say a few words about the work that the fellows have done.
Okay, so I'm just going to cross my fingers that I'm showing the right screen. How is that looking for people?
That's great, thanks, Nicola.
Fantastic. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Charles, for the introduction. And just to emphasize, the project that I'll be talking about today is just a third of one of the three Language Fellows projects. I think I saw both Emanuelle on the panel and Michelle also joining us. And if you want to find out a little bit more about their two separate projects, there's been a recent issue just of Languages, Society and Policy online. And I don't know if anyone could put that in the chat, or I can put it in later, which would give a bit more information on those two other projects. And Liz, it's very nice to see you. I mean, I know it's only online, but that still feels exciting, having emailed back and forth and not actually seen you before. So thank you. And thanks very much to the ILCS for hosting this. So I'm just going to run through a few slides that draw out very few key points from the article. I wasn't quite sure how much detail to go into, so if it's too much or too little, apologies, and I'm sure people can prompt with questions as we go. So I think the first thing to say is that our project, which I did with Katie as a postdoc, more than the other two projects, was massively dependent on the goodwill of a huge number of other people in contributing to it. So the reason that we have such rich data that informed that article is the really excellent number of responses that we got, over 500 in total, together with a number of interviews, and really good representation across all career stages and different types of research career experience. So, anything useful that's come out of this is really thanks to everybody who gave their time, and whoever has time to fill out a survey. So I'm really grateful to the people who did find time and then contributed to the interviews. The goals that I summarised the AHRC, this was kind of what we aimed to do, was to ascertain the status quo of languages research, about areas, methods, outputs, impacts, what new areas of research were emerging, what is underrepresented. And the AHRC was particularly interested in the gap analysis between present capability and the future state of languages research. And sort of understated in that, implicit in that, was what the AHRC and what the government would like to see coming out of languages research. And there was also a degree of housekeeping for the AHRC, updating keywords and so on, which I won't say much about or any more about. Some of the positives that came out, apart from just the very high response rate and the fact that people did give so many details, there was really an impressively rich amount of information that we gathered about new ways of approaching research, new directions, methods. And what was interesting to see was that how many of those actually do relate to the things that the government would agree or international priorities would see as being big questions. So things like inequalities of all kinds, the climate emergency, education. Another theme, which I'm not going to say too much more about, but I think it did come through in quite a lot of the comments, a strong commitment to curiosity-driven research, so one that isn't just meeting the challenges and the agendas set by other priorities, but that is really just fundamental research. And obviously that is really important as well. And the other thing that came through really, really strongly is just the huge depth of experience that people who replied showed of working with stakeholders of all kinds, locally, some really good local partnerships, nationally, internationally. This was an area, doing a survey, you have your ebbs and flows, your highs and lows when you're crunching the data. And really one of the high points was just seeing the breadth and depth of experience that we as a community have, and huge reserves of potential, way beyond the kind of the cream that we see in those carefully nurtured impact case studies. There's a great deal more experience, and that was really, really encouraging to see. A few key themes that emerged that I think are kind of summarized in the or expressed in the recommendations. One theme is certainly inclusion and equality of access in the broadest sense, access to funding, access to support for researchers who are in post, and a big issue was also the pipeline from, sorry, that's supposed to say UK undergraduates to doctoral study, where there seemed to be somewhat of an underrepresentation of our own homegrown undergraduates making it through to doctoral research and beyond. And another theme that came through is, I'm just calling it a mismatch between languages research capacity and what the government imagines it should be or could be, and with the AHRC caught somewhere in the middle. And that's both to do with the languages range and the languages which are on the government's radar as being its highest priorities, and also its areas of thematic focus. So one of the things we were asked to do was look at government areas of research interest, many of which are things that we do have an angle on, but certainly none of them were asking about literature, and given not directly about literature, and given that about half of the colleagues who replied to the survey have an interest in literature as well, often with other thematic foci, I think that is just worth signalling. And then the big question, which I hope maybe will come up today, is to what extent do we want to address this challenge, this mismatch between what people imagine languages might be, languages research, and the shape it is at the moment. I would suggest somewhat. I don't think we should lose the fundamental curiosity-driven research, but I also think there are opportunities and benefits to embracing some of the challenge-led and multidisciplinary research, and making sure that we enable each other step by step to build the expertise to do that. So this is just a screenshot really of the recommendations, just as a reminder to people, which I coded by letter just to make it a bit easier to refer to them. I'm not going to go through them all, because I'm assuming if you're here, you've made yourself look at them briefly already, or will be looking at them as people are talking. But just a few to pick out here. Under C, the tension between curiosity-led research, but also one of our recommendations was to really take some leadership in demystifying the ways in which language researchers can address challenge-led research and interdisciplinary, even transdisciplinary research. Things like really quite obvious goals that many of us could do if we were more confident in talking the talk, I think, to be quite honest. Things like sustainable development goals, digital humanities, and other big question thematic calls that might come out. Another theme that I really hope we'll address is the fairly uneven mentoring that is available to colleagues depending on where they're based, in the type of institution they're in, particularly because some colleagues, and increasingly, in fact, are not based in a languages specialist research unit. And that can be both an advantage or a disadvantage. You can get a broader perspective, but you haven't got the kind of the narrow scaffolding around you to develop your research, depending what career stage you're at. In the next little group of recommendations, I suggested a programme of awareness raising for how to engage with government, and things like the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, the Institute for Government, Open Innovation Team, Cross Whitehall Languages Group. There are lots of routes into beginning a conversation with government. One thing I learnt was that I thought everyone else knew how to do it, and I didn't. And what I learned from talking to a number of colleagues through this project, people outside languages, and even people whose role is to facilitate the interface between government and academics, there is no route one, there's no magic solution, but being aware of the different routes in, I think could be very useful. I think it might be useful to map structural funding inequalities, even within quite small amounts, differences between subject associations within languages, and to perhaps look at a way to allocate funds to address an imbalance. I'm conscious of that. I may be driven by my own institution, which sets so much store by funding. So even if it's a small amount of funding, if it's external funding, it's excellent. If it's internal funding, we're not interested. So the fact that you might be in French that has access to a bigger pot, whereas if you're in, I don't know, Korean studies, there isn't a similar pot to apply for, could actually be holding people back in their career trajectory. So I think that's something to look at. And another point on that slide is just the skills development of colleagues at all stages. So I think the ILCS has a really good history of providing excellent training, and that was commented on, but particularly aimed at postgrads and early career researchers. And I think there's an opportunity to ensure that colleagues at all stages are aware of these opportunities and to develop opportunities in the areas that we want to focus on strategically. And then I think this is my last group. Yep. One practical action point, we may want to discuss this, but is just being honest about the funding norms, the success of funding among colleagues. Again, I may be slightly skewed by my awareness of how important funding is in our own institution for career development and career advancement, but just being honest about the fact that it is not a realistic expectation that every well-performing researcher who is, within 5 years of their or 10 years of their PhD will have got some of the big ticket council funding. That just isn't realistic, and we need to be being honest about that when we're talking to colleagues who are designing promotion criteria. I think we need to understand more about the pipeline for students getting into doctoral languages research, and that may well be a topic that you've got on your agenda, Charles, since you talked about the changes to funding that are coming. And then cold spots in language degree provision, where I'm not the expert on this, and Becky's in the room and she is the expert. But we did talk about that because it was one of the themes that emerged through our canvassing of researchers, their sense of isolation, particularly outside Russell Group universities. And if you don't have students taking the courses in sufficient numbers, you certainly don't have enough people being able to do research in those kind of institutions. And the whole problem of inclusion or lack of inclusion will just be perpetuated. So I think those are my key points, and I've just put back at the end here the same slide. I don't know if it's useful to keep up for a moment for people to look at, but I think one of the things to consider there is who is going to own these actions, if anyone agrees that they should be actions, and who's going to coordinate it. Because as Charles was saying, it's great to say someone should do X, but it's much harder to make X actually happen unless we know who's doing it and who's going to be coordinating it to make it happen. So shall I leave it there and stop sharing, Charles? Liz, does that sound good?
Yep. Okay, yes, that's great, Nicola. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, for setting up the discussion. And following on from Nicola's points, we're going to go straight into our panel and to ask them just very generally, what are the most salient points that they've noted for from the article, and what are their first thoughts about that? So I'm just going to ask people almost at random what they have to say about things. So perhaps Becky, would you like to say a couple of words about what is striking you most in the work that's been done here?
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Nicola. I thought it was an excellent report. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to discuss it with everyone today. I've picked out a couple of things that particularly spoke to me. And thank you, Nicola, for mentioning cold spots, because of course that's where I'm coming from. So the things that most spoke to me, first of all, I learned so much from the report in terms of the historical contextualizing. That's not what I went into the report to read, but so informative and really made me understand why the sector is as it is at the moment. I've been deliberately, like lots of people, using languages to mean all signed, oral, ancient, modern languages from anywhere around the world, and wasn't aware of the extent to which modern languages in this country meant just French and German, not even just not ancient or not signed, but European and the languages of our biggest neighbours. And I suppose you can see that in terms of what's taught in schools, but I hadn't realised that's what the word had implied. And again, I hadn't realised the extent to which modern languages study or research implied literature, which you mentioned is still the case in a lot of cases. But the fact that the inclusion of, say, translation or linguistics as part of modern languages, or languages is something that is a newer way of thinking about the sector. And I think the report made a really important point that we mustn't overlook the really interesting and important research that's being done outside of what you might see as a traditional modern languages department. So I'm grateful to see that, and I think that's related to Liz's point earlier about promoting vitality in the sector, to see what's happening and make sure we support that. And again, I particularly welcome the comments about unequal access to research time and funding. I was previously at York St John University, which is a very small widening participation university, where academics have much less time, much less resource, no research leave or sabbaticals. There might be some conference funding that you can apply for, but much smaller pots of conference funding, or for example, small pots of money like prompt priming that is much less accessible. And so I'm glad the report highlighted that really important difference, and made the point that someone could be a mid-career researcher or a later career researcher, but have effectively been in a teaching only position for many years. So that's a really welcome point. And just to finish, I feel slightly uncomfortable with the research group, non-research group kind of binary framing in the report. I'm aware that we're all universities, whenever we were made into a university, we are now all a university. There's only 47 universities that now offer languages to degree level in England. So I guess in the UK, about 60. It's a small number. We're a small sector. We need to be working together as a sector. And I think as a group of people, we need to work out how to talk about inequalities and differences between universities, how to improve access for underrepresented groups such as people with disabilities, or various ethnicities, different socioeconomic backgrounds, etc. Somehow we need to talk about those differences without dividing the sector into two and talking about Russell Group and non-Russell Group. And I don't know the answer either. I've been talking about higher tariff and lower tariff, but kind of aware that effectively it's a similar thing. So I think that's something we can work on between ourselves to think about how we frame that. But yeah, I'm delighted to be on the panel, and I hope my job can be to keep saying, what about lower tariff universities whenever we have these conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Becky. I think that question of some of the divisions that there are, we need to think about, and I think absolutely we need to change. I'm going to invite Liam to say a few words now.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think, speaking really broadly, the thing that really spoke to me from reading this report and related documents is that it shows the complexity of the expansion of the field into a field of languages, a field of languages more broadly. And that's a change that I feel like has been part of my university experience so far. Having completed my PhD in a department, well, started in a department of French, which then became modern languages, and then in the work that I've been doing more recently, thinking about languages more broadly, even without the modern. So this report really made me think about the complexity of that expansion, whilst a lot of the research in the field remains what it has been for decades anyway, and that kind of movement comes with a lot of challenges as people try to think of different types of ways of researching. The thing that really stood out for me moving from there is the idea of challenge-led research and how big a shift that would actually be for many of the scholars and teachers working in languages. But it's certainly something that I've noticed as an early career researcher, looking at funding bids that are appropriate to my level. I don't feel like I'm really trained enough to think about designing research projects that are challenge-led. And I think as a field, we do need to be better at, and we need perhaps more mentoring and more opportunities to think really about how we fit into those kind of calls. And finally, I did get from the report how much mentoring is going to be important as we start to understand a bit more about what languages as a field is, especially for early career researchers and teachers. And one of the things that I think that we need to work more on, which the report perhaps was missing in the report because it's not a part of languages, is really building PhD and postdocs into research projects and designing them and embedding early career researchers into research projects, which I don't think happens enough in languages, but it does happen in other fields. And so that's what I think is something that we really could work on, especially if we're designing projects that are aimed at policy and work with government. So those are just a few ideas that I got from this report, but thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Liam. That's great. Plenty of things for us to come back to and really think through there. I'm going to ask Emanuelle to say a couple of words. More than a couple of words, indeed.
There's more than two. Thank you so very much for having me here. And thank you so much for sharing this article. I mean, for me, it was absolutely great reading it and having and learning more about how research is structured in the UK. One of the things that caught my attention is something that is not really much there, and Nicola and Katie have pointed to it as they worked on the article, is this idea, and I'll build on to Becky's view on the Russell group and non-Russell group division, and the idea of male, female, and the things that the authors lament about, that there are no ethnicity added to it, no ethnicity, no class, and no information on whether the researchers being responding the survey were British or not, or are a product of British academia or not product of British academia. And that was interesting because this a bit more of a portrait of that would perhaps fit into some of the considerations that the authors made later on about what is the makeover of the postgraduate population that actually responded to the survey. But one of the things that calls my attention is also as well a bit of a mismatch in terms of how the report comes and brings in teaching, and then it goes into research, because it seems to be a bit of a mismatch in the ways in which our research goes back into teaching, because my experience of modern languages in the UK is that as departments, we're largely funded by students being as part of our courses. And one of the conversations I've been having here at Birmingham, and some resistance that I have found in some more senior colleagues, is to get them to put, say, research back in the open day. And I was told that marketing departments usually say that undergraduate students, when they go and try to choose a university, they are not really looking for a big research mind. They're looking at where they're located, how nice it is to go. And this is a bit of an interesting thing because the report starts with teaching and then it goes into research, but I really don't see, and the report doesn't go deeper into saying how the research retrofeeds into teaching and retrofeeds into that culture, which again has other implications in terms of who is the staff doing most of the teaching and how are modern languages perceived by students, and to what extent the research that we do in modern languages is perceived as what people perceive as doing when they come to do modern languages. I don't know if I express myself properly, but my experience, for example, is that most of the colleagues doing the kind of impactful research, or that would be responding, even had the time to respond to the call, would be colleagues who would be doing less of the actual teaching that our students take. And another thing that kind of concerned me a little bit is because as an academic in the UK, I feel a lot of pressure in terms of impact. And as far as I understand, impact and the societal importance of our research is always in function of the communities of people living in the United Kingdom. So the report also talks about the potential for international impact and how desirable that is. But I wonder whether the kind of conversation, the semantics about us making ourselves more talking the talk and more marketable, more important by state-sponsored pockets of funding will lend themselves to ideologies that end up being self-servicing. There is so much about modern languages that is about understanding the world beyond the United Kingdom, and to what extent those feature in it. Do you see what I mean? And it actually goes a bit hand in hand. So what is the role of the non-British academic in modern languages beyond the language tutor? What kind of research they're going to be doing, what kind of research is requested from them, and to what extent are we free to bringing, just to be doing knowledge, curiosity-driven research. So those are the things. I think there is a bit in the thing and again, the report is a portrait of the research that is there, and a portrait of the research that is there is a portrait of the researchers that are there working as researchers with access to time, to funding, and perhaps a bit more of questionings about who responded could give us more indications on that front, because of course I'm doing speculations here because that information wasn't provided, so the authors couldn't talk about them. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Emanuelle. So much there to really be thinking through, and of course the great value of this is that we're thinking about, yes, in response to this report, the work that Katie and Nicola have done on the article, but these are massive questions that should be really built into the way in which we think about everything to do with our job and the societies in which it is located. I'm going to ask Abir to say a few words, and then Naomi.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. I found the essay extremely important. The kind of it untangles many trends that we talk about obliquely, but don't necessarily go in depth into. So in many ways, it kind of sheds light on these various trends. But at the same time, what was particularly interesting for me was the ways in which, despite these trends being divided into different kind of categories, they were all also very entangled with one another. So we cannot think about challenge-led research without thinking about the question of the gaps in our understanding of interdisciplinarity, for example, or PhD students, or, all of this is so intricately intersecting that it's impossible to speak about one without the other. For me, what is particularly interesting is, 49% considered a possible theme of global engagement and sustainable development goals as not for me. And this is actually for me quite striking because it makes me wonder as to whether we know enough about what researchers want to do. And this is and part of the value of this project is that it begins to give us a sense of what researchers want to do. And we can talk about later, Leon's questions about challenge-led research is obviously very pertinent. So that's one. The question of academics with disability in modern languages is a very, very significant one. I do question the statistics, not because they're inaccurate, but rather that they are an indication of possibly the number of academics who disclose their disability rather than the number of academics with disabilities in modern languages, because higher education is extremely performance driven. And so there is this sense of stigmatization if you're not able to achieve this performance. And many academics choose not to disclose their disabilities. So we need to be get a stronger understanding of the lived experience of academics with disabilities, especially in modern languages. And we can talk about that in more detail. And the third point for me was the cross-pollination and the cross-fertilization between the social sciences and modern languages. And for me, this is an extremely welcome shift, which adds to the vitality, but also speaks to questions around challenge-led research and all other aspects of I mean, it sheds light on how the sort of cross-pollination is enriching what we do, how we do it, how we think about complex questions. So thank you. I really, really enjoyed reading this, the findings of this project.
Thank you, Abir. Some very important considerations there that I do think have a huge consequences for the way in which we try to think about the intricacy of all these issues and the way, as you said, they intersect with one another and cannot be separated. Naomi.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat what others have said. I think it's a fascinating picture of the landscape, and I think a lot of interesting points have been raised. So I'm going to just pick out one point that is particularly interesting to me. I think it's very encouraging to see this very strong engagement with kind of relatively recent but increasingly important kind of trends in the research kind of areas in the humanities that are growing in importance. But I have to say, it's also quite surprising, and I think I was particularly struck that 1 in 6 respondents listed digital humanities as an area of their research. Now, as somebody who works kind of across languages and digital humanities, and actually I'm just in the middle of a digital humanities conference that I've left for this panel, my engagements with DH, modern languages is a very marginal presence in digital humanities still, particularly compared to history and English. So I'm quite surprised to see that number of people within the modern languages community saying it's part of their research. 1 in 6 is a very large number, and it doesn't necessarily match my experience. And I think it goes back to some of the points that others have raised, is who are the types of people who respond to surveys that are looking at the kind of future direction of the discipline. And I think, inevitably you're going to get people who are very aware of, and interested in where the research landscape's going. And I think that's a kind of inevitable challenge of these types of surveys. You get people who are interested in the questions you're raising. But I do think maybe it does indicate positively, that I think people have an increasingly expansive understanding of digital humanities, which I think is really important, and an increasing understanding that it impacts across different areas of research in different ways, and that we can define that. I think some people think digital humanities is a specific thing, but, I think people are increasingly seeing that the digital can impact in different ways, and that we can kind of shape what we understand by the digital humanities. But I think there is an important point here of why modern languages still isn't very visible in digital humanities. I think it is that we need to be doing that outward facing work. We do need to be engaging in these cross humanities and, cross other disciplinary communities more. I think we do need to be, we need to do the work internally, and this maybe gets to the challenge-led research, which I know will be picked up later, but we need to be visible in things like the new Association of Digital Humanities in the UK and Ireland, and how do we ensure our community is really central to those kind of cross-disciplinary initiatives and kind of really playing our part there. The other point, I won't touch on it. I think there is a connection here to training and skills, but I think the strong appetite for training and to be able to feel confident in these maybe cross-disciplinary communities, I think that is linked to training. The stronger appetite for training, I think it might come back later in the discussion to feasibility. I do think particularly for mid-career, we also have to think about, how people fit training and new skills development in alongside the pressures of teaching, the pressures of REF to produce, how do you train? There's a lot of focus on producing the publications, but actually not much focus on developing the skills to be able to produce that new research. So, but I think that maybe will be picked up later in the discussion.
Thank you, Naomi. That's an extraordinarily interesting take on what people say, what they do, and where we are going with a discipline and where we need to be, both in location and in the visibility that comes with that. I mean, I'm just going to ask one supplementary question before passing the chair to Liz, who's going to pick up on EDI issues, and that is, in some respects, and you've touched on that, there is a kind of curious contradiction between people saying that they want to be addressing very significant global issues, and yet at the same time, responsive mode applications tend to dominate modern languages applications for funding in a way that's about 20% more than other cognate disciplines. So that is a question. Should one be doing all one can to push challenge-led research? And a related question is this distinction between social sciences and modern languages one that we want to really maintain, or should we be seeking to break that down? Is the distinction between area studies and modern languages necessarily a good one? So just to condense that, yeah, do we want to try as a disciplinary community to push challenge-led research, dealing with major societal issues, and do we think that some of the distinctions that we operate with between area studies, social sciences and modern languages are worth maintaining? So very general questions, but if we can have just a few reflections on that. I know that in a sense we've already touched upon that. I'm just going to change things around a little bit, and I'll ask Emanuelle to begin with a couple of observations.
Charles, when you say that, I wonder whether we can actually answer that question when we don't understand how the labor is organized. Because where are people going to take the time to do this? Right? I mean, how many hours is a person teaching a day? How many modules are they convening? How many internal pressures do they have in terms of departmental roles and responsibilities? How much time do you have to have coffee with other people to get to know them, to get to know a team of researchers in other disciplines? And to what extent do things go with the grain? Do you see what I mean? For example, we were talking about, okay, let's try to address a major challenge. But essentially, I never see these people unless I make time on my diary by not doing other things to go there. And you see what I mean? Like, one of the things that I keep talking about, that modern languages, and it's been working as modern languages because people are working more together. There's more, people are teaching more together. There are more shared modules that there were 10 years ago. People are doing these things more, and the content and language integrated kind of curriculums, they allow for that kind of stuff because the teaching space makes we are trapped in this space where we have to work together. But the thing is, and others have pointed to this, if you do have a lot of lone scholar work, and you do have optional modules, and you do have all of these other responsibilities, how can we? Because if you ask me, Charles, it's like, Emanuelle, do you think we should maintain the difference between social sciences and human? I do sociology of literature. I don't think that should be a thing to begin with. But I wouldn't respond to that because I'm pretty sure that others would have reasons to keep those separate. I think that those synergies, they are intrinsic. And if you ask me what's the difference between model languages and area studies, I personally struggle to see that difference. I can understand how it works in the UK, but I struggle to see that difference. My comment to your comment in that sense would I wonder whether we can dream that dream of doing things differently when our conditions of work, when are not charted enough for us to understand how conducive they can be for us to dream that dream. Otherwise, those of our colleagues who are more seniors, who already have a bit more room because they already have more bought out time, they can be doing that, while the rest of us is always going to have to be running after whatever call is already there with already a little bit of a nod to something that you can offer, so you can actually apply for it and get that little bit of extra time in order to progress in your career and have the time to mature that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one has to be extremely mindful of the extreme pressures that people are under in term time and not under term time. And I think it is beholden upon various institutes to facilitate pathways that enable this cross-fertilization of different disciplinary communities, and to think about the way in which one can facilitate that work. And possibly also to be thinking more incrementally about changes that might be for the good of everyone. Totally. Becky, do you want to say a couple of words on this?
Thank you. Just two short thoughts. First of all, in terms of challenge-led research, I wonder whether the kind of questions that people are interested in might align very well with funding calls in challenge-led research, but then additional constraints around the funding might mean they can't apply. So, for example, if a particular funding call says you have to be a certain number of years post PhD, or it has to be a multi-author project with people from multiple universities, perhaps in multiple countries. So it might not be a mismatch between the topics or an inability to align with a topic. It might be the other constraints that people can't meet. And then my other thought, you mentioned modern languages versus area studies and whether we're right to carry on with those two distinctions. I didn't know until I read this report that modern languages as defined by the REF was, as I said earlier on, defined as European languages, and that anything outside of that was moved into area studies. So I don't understand that distinction at all. I presume it makes sense to somebody, but it doesn't make sense to me as someone fairly new to the sector. So I don't get that. I think languages and linguistics might make sense, but to split into European and not European, I don't understand.
Thank you, Becky. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's more of a private view. And I think there is a question about how change can be introduced and where it comes from, and bottom-up change and change at a sustainable pace. But there are issues, I think, that one does need to think about quite boldly around distinctions. Abir.
Yes. For me, I think that a mixed economy approach is quite important because it speaks to the complexity of research on the ground. We need to preserve the space for lone scholars to be able to develop their projects, but at the same time, we cannot forget that, for example, the language or the focus on impact has become is increasing, and so challenge-led research lends itself to more impactful kind of value or yields more impact. And so for this reason, we need to also be encouraging it, but at the same time, we need to be able to provide the appropriate infrastructure that would train and support researchers to undertake challenge-led research. I mean, and for me, one of the biggest questions is, the findings note that there are question marks around what constitutes interdisciplinarity, and I see challenge-led research as not just involving interdisciplinarity, but a radical form of interdisciplinarity. So if we want to encourage one, we need to also be investigating and questioning more what interdisciplinarity is and is not. And we need to also enable researchers to undertake these projects. How do they co-design such projects? It's a form of research that involves dialogic leadership rather than a primary leadership kind of model. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration. To move to the question of area studies and modern languages, it is well documented now, for example, that the ethnographic impulse in modern languages it operates in a very natural and organic way. So I don't see how imposing rigid barriers is going to really help the discipline move forward. The future directions, quite the opposite. And I would urge institutions, faculties, departments not to take a rigid approach, especially during for progression criteria. I think there has to be a positive acknowledgement of the importance of this cross-fertilization. I think it's extremely important, and I'm one of those who is fully in favor of it.
Thank you, Abir. Absolutely. I mean, these are issues that are so multifaceted that one has to tread carefully, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that one shouldn't be quite robust. And I think it is beholden upon us as a community to do all we can to shape things with an understanding of what things are like on the ground, but also things that we're not happy with. And I think that we can exert some change over. I'm going to ask Liam to say a couple of words, and then I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to come in with at the end of this discussion. Liam.
Yeah, so I thanks to Naomi for saying that about digital humanities, because I definitely felt the same thing about environmental humanities, and hearing a lot of talk about these big umbrella terms, but not perhaps, I wouldn't be able to put my finger on, I wouldn't recognize languages as doing an enormous amount of research in that area. And I also agree with Emanuelle about the time that is involved in developing challenge-led projects. I think over the past year, I've been fortunate to get onto an AHRC project at Nottingham, working with scientists, but it's in the Department of Classics and Archaeology. And I think that one of the things that I've realised being on that project is that actually, as linguists, we have an extraordinary thing to offer, which is access to languages. And outside of languages, this is seen as something that's really valuable, but it's not something that people will necessarily think is essential to developing research projects. But I think we need to make the case that it is essential that other cultural, historical, and linguistic perspectives are built directly into big challenge-led research projects, so that those perspectives are directly fed into it and it doesn't all just become Anglo-centric. And there was a message in the chat as well about it being beholden on the languages community itself to develop mentoring across institutions and across departments. And I think that's quite an important thing for us to think about, because again, as linguists, we're very used to talking to people, even within our own departments, who are working across a huge range of different subfields with different methodologies. And I don't think we really think about the ways that that is an enormous advantage for us as researchers, and it's not exploited enough, the skills that we already have, just by the way that we are positioned in our schools and departments.
Absolutely, I don't think anyone would disagree with any of that, Liam. And I think this is a challenge both to work cross-institutionally, but also to think about how national infrastructure, of which the School of Advanced Study with its different institutes has a massive role to play in thinking and facilitating interdisciplinary research, and really sort of working out what the difficulties are at the point of access to that. And yeah, absolutely. What we have to offer is the really range and extent of that is not always as clear to us as it is to different communities. Naomi.
I again echoing a lot of points, but I think, as I've said, there's still obviously a strong place for responsive mode funding, but I do think there are the pressures, and I agree with a lot of the limitations that stop people applying for these calls, but I do think we do also need to make sure modern languages people there are ways of being, I think, more creative and more ambitious in thinking about how we do contribute to these wider research agendas. And I think what's particularly important to remember is when thematic or challenge-led calls come out, they're actually there for us to shape. So, if we think that call doesn't talk about language, or literature is being neglected and we think it has a place, well, unless we engage and put in a proposal that says language needs to be addressed in this challenge, or, literature has a role to play here. So I think it's worth us remembering that those calls are put out by the AHRC or UKRI, but they are there for us to shape and say, this call needs to address this and make a compelling case. And, I think thinking about how we respond to those calls by putting our agendas or the interests, or, where we really think, language science is really making this call very, Anglophone or excluding other knowledges, and really putting that at the forefront. But I also want to go back to Liam's point, which I think is really important, about we're not training ECRs and PhDs to be ready for these challenge-led calls. And challenge-led calls, they are often pitched at the most senior people in the field, at very privileged. Yeah, I think there is a perception that these are for, the top, the really experienced people in the field, the big institutions that always get the funding. And I think also postdoc funding schemes, the main postdoc funding schemes are very lone researcher model. They're almost like doing a PhD again. And why don't we change that? Why don't we really think radically about what postdoc, if you've done a PhD, we can also look at the PhD. We need to look at embedding collaboration more in the PhD as well. But particularly postdoc schemes, we should really think about, are the current postdoc schemes, which have been running a long time, are they fit for preparing people? And it'd be really interesting to see like an ECR scheme that was collaborative and team-based and said, let's have a team of ECRs lead on this challenge-based issue. And I think to think quite radically about that, and whether we can think radically, particularly about those postdoc and ECR funding schemes, and whether they are fit for purpose for preparing people for collaborative and challenge-led kind of research projects.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I mean, I think this change that we sort of sense, and this report really much does focus on that, makes us aware of the fact that we do have considerable agency in the shaping of funding calls and in the way in which they can be adapted and molded. And we can not only do that, but we can also very much voice our sense of what works and what doesn't work, and what is not up to speed, and what are the contradictions in some of the ways in which funding and also policy is organized. Great, so I'm going to sort of ask Liz to take over the chairing now. So we'll leave and also to lead about, well, where we can go with this. So Liz, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay.
It's all yours.
Brilliant, thank you. I've just been scribbling down lots of the things that people have been saying, really fascinating stuff. I think what I'd like to pick up on is the idea of inequalities that we've kind of been touching on as we've been going through. And I think what for me came through really strongly in the report was the different ways in which these kinds of inequalities manifest themselves. So that's, to some extent around inequalities around research time and time for the research support, precarity in terms of contracts, disability, and other elements, I think, which promote or enable inequality. So I've got two questions really. They're kind of interlinked, so I'll put them out together, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond to either or in a kind of a combined way. The first caveat, though, is we've talked a little bit about that distinction between Russell Group and non-Russell Group, and I think it's really more helpful to think about it as a continuum from very intensive research universities to much less intensive, because I think even within the Russell Group, there are significant differences to your experience of how much research time you might have available. And outside of the research group, again, there'll be institutions which support in different ways. So I think maybe thinking of it as a continuum rather than as a binary divide might be helpful. So I guess the questions I've got are what actions can the panel see subject associations adopting to increase parity of opportunity? So what can we do in terms of subject associations? And how can we as disciplinary communities attempt to lessen the divide for research opportunities between colleagues in more and less research intensive institutions? And I think Hillary's already picked up a little bit about that in the comments where she's talking about how we can mentor across institutions, how we can work in interdisciplinary ways. So maybe if we can pick up on that as well as we go through. So there's two elements around which are really around how do we level the playing field a little bit. Naomi, can I start with you, because you've gone last both times, so start with you this time.
Okay, so the kind of, the parity of opportunity, I think, it will touch on maybe some of the other themes. I think we need to address precarity as the key issue here, because I think, and this is where I think we do need to focus our energies in subject associations, because I think it's departmental closures, but the precarity of ECRs, but also, bringing in different types of people into, you know, let's say recruiting PhD students. I feel uncomfortable recruiting PhD students without making them very aware of how difficult that post-PhD stage is, and without wanting to put people, you know, like it becomes a self-perpetuating circle as well. It's very tricky to, you know, you don't want the discipline becoming, you know, smaller, but also, you know, very elitist and only attracting people who have a safety net for that precarity period. And that is the reality of what happens. If you don't have a safety net after PhD, it's, can you encourage people who are already living perhaps in precarious situations to then say, well, you know, best case scenario after your PhD, you're going to be on fixed term contracts. And that's, you know, the reality and different levels of experience. So I think all of our energy as subject associations has to be around foregrounding how damaging precarity is on the sector, on trying to bring in different people. And, you know, I'm sure we've all had difficult conversations with people who've said, I can't make those sacrifices after the PhD. I don't, you know, for health reasons or for mental health or those questions, I can't make the sacrifices that maybe other people in more comfortable positions can make certain sacrifices or can make certain allowances. So I think, yeah, my big question is we really need to put precarity at the forefront. And then obviously, I think with the Russell Group and the non-Russell Group, obviously it is not to reinforce those divisions, but it's the non-Russell Group who've been at the forefront, obviously, of departmental closures. And none of us can escape that. But I think, you know, the people who are still in departments in Russell Groups are under a huge amount of pressure. So it is, I think, collaborations, I think the best thing we can do is bring a wide range of, if we are putting together, let's say, big funding calls, really looking at who we're including in those calls, and are we going to the same people, are we going to the same institutions? And I think it is, as would be emphasised, we really need to be thinking collaboratively in who we're including and excluding when we put together teams. But I will leave others, I think, who can talk more on that perspective as well.
Thanks, Naomi. I think that, yeah, that's a really important point. And I think we've all had those difficult conversations with people who you think this, you know, you would be a brilliant PhD student, but I need you to be aware of quite how precarious the world post PhD is. And that's a really depressing thing to have to do, I think, but important. And I think to some extent, the AHRC is acknowledging that in the way they're looking at what's the future of PhD funding going to look like, and the emphasis on training for careers post PhD. Now, the way in which they're emphasising we need to prepare students for the fact there probably isn't going to be a job for them at the end of it. And I think an important idea about working across institutions as well, about making sure that UKRI money or other funding money isn't concentrated in specific institutions, which then creates a cycle, doesn't it? So a self-fulfilling cycle. Liam, can I ask you to come in on those questions, please?
Yeah, I agree with Naomi, and that was that was partly one of my points, so I won't repeat that. One of the smaller ideas that I think is really important, and which the report did really well, was to make language really clear. So I think that inclusivity and parity of opportunity starts with language. And for a field that is very focused on questions of language, we have an enormous lot of acronyms and different bodies and different subject associations and special interest groups and things like that, which are really difficult to navigate as early career academics, especially if you've just come out of your PhD. So I think one of the things I liked about the report was that it tended to avoid acronyms, spelt things out very clearly, what was being discussed, and provided links to things. And so I think that's just a really important thing to think about, especially in an expanded field of languages. And the other thing that the two more things that I'd like to say, I think that mentoring is really important, and we should be making the case for institutions valuing colleagues who take part in mentoring schemes. We need to be more explicit about why that is useful. when people do that. So there are models for mentoring schemes, like with UCML, the Early Career Academic Mentoring Scheme, which works really well. But it needs people to sign up to that, and it needs people to be role models and to have projects that are role models for earlier career academics. And also going back to Naomi's thinking about some of the more conservative postdoctoral funding opportunities, we really need to kind of lobby those institutions for more clarity on what their success criteria are and who is judging the panels, because those postdoctoral opportunities often define who gets a job at the end, and yet we know almost nothing about what the success criteria are for those. And that seems to me, that is very concerning to me and has been of increasing concern over the past couple of years. So I think not lobbying those institutions for that information only serves what Naomi was saying, and it only serves those people who can just sit and wait out the time. And that seems to me like terrible for parity of opportunity. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Liam. And I'll just increase that shout out for the UCML mentoring scheme. It's a really rewarding thing to be involved with. So if you do have capacity, please do consider becoming involved in that scheme. Could I go to Abir and then Becky, please?
Yes, I think I don't have more to add than what Naomi and Liam have said. So I just want to state the obvious, that we need to have more representatives from non-Russell universities, more collaborations. Funding bodies need to make sure that funding also goes to non-Russell universities. And be very proactive about this. And even within the Russell Group, as you state, there are also hierarchies. So we need to be careful about this. I would also say, and this is stating the obvious, the unconscious bias in reviewing funding applications. How are reviewers also thinking about the question of Russell and non-Russell groups? And we also need to be attentive to the fact that scholars in modern languages in non-Russell group universities tend to be scattered around. So we need to be attentive as to where they are, rather than, we think about this university as having a department of modern languages, but in some non-Russell universities, that is not necessarily the case. So we also need to be attentive to this. So that would be these would be the points, but this is simply to reinforce what Naomi and Liam have said.
Thanks, Abir. So we're talking really about that's coming through very strongly is collaboration across institutions and enabling colleagues, not just within your own department, but within the discipline across the country, and those kind of regional almost regional networks. I think it seems to me that you're suggesting strengthening the ties within a region to create an experience in lots of ways, I guess, in which some of the DTPs do at the moment at postgraduate level. Could I ask Becky to come in and then Emanuelle?
Thank you, Liz. In terms of subject associations, I don't have a lot to add other than to thank Nicola for her pointing out that there's more access to small pots of research funding if you're working in French than if you're working in Korean, say, or more so if you're working in a sign language or a language that isn't so often taught in the UK. So thank you for that really important point. In terms of Russell Group versus non-Russell Group, or I like your idea of you're pointing out of the continuum, Liz, between universities with relatively more research support and those with less research support and resource. I think that's important. I suppose we need to recognise that the massive differences in resource are coming from other places too, such as the amount of international students in different universities. That means that some universities are much more well-funded than others. And I'm not an expert on this at all, so someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, QR funding is designed to sort of centralise research in in research intensive universities. So that again is sort of making some universities be much more better resourced than others. I think it's really important that researchers from less well-resourced universities have a voice in events like this. And I kind of, as someone who used to work at York St John, going, oh, what about the lower tariff universities? But there's no one from a university like that here in the room. Everyone here is representing a university that is relatively well-resourced. And anytime people want to, I've got a lovely list of universities and researchers who are doing interesting things. I'm so happy to pass on sort of names to make sure that we are better represented in events like this. And that's important because I can guess what people might want from my own experience, but we need to hear it firsthand. So it might be, like the report mentions, that making more small pots of money available is important. So to do things like go and present a conference paper that you might not have access to money to do, or sort of pump priming money, something that could enable you to take a semester of research leave, the kind of things that might be taken for granted in some universities but are not available at all somewhere else. And I think in terms of levelling the playing field for bigger pots of funding, the issue, of course, is that everything is competitive, and the way that the criteria for receiving funding is generally what you've done before. Have you received funding before? Do you have the certain number of research outputs, etc.? And it's hard for people who are judging things to take into account to a sufficient extent the difference in opportunity in different universities. I think that's really important, not just for promotion criteria, like Nicola, was it you? Somebody was talking about earlier, but actually for the criteria in terms of getting funding, that those can be contextualized so that someone who's come from a university with less research support, with less research resource, with less research time, that can be taken into account when research is then awarded, when funding is awarded. And it might be that one of the things that could be done is that the research funding calls could be targeted to particular universities, and that might be one way to level the playing field. I think that's all. Thank you. I'm really glad this question was addressed because it is really important.
Thanks, Becky. And there's a comment in the chat from Saskia saying, could funding bodies introduce quotas and or contextual points for non-Russell Group institutions, which I think is picking up on some of the points that you're making. And I wonder whether there's a role for us as subject associations here as well, because for example, in UCML we have a small grants fund that people can bid into, and maybe that might be something we might want to think about. Is do we want to think about are people coming from institutions which maybe have less funding available for them, and is that something that we might want to add to our criteria? And particularly when you made the point about different disciplines have different amounts of money available as well, might we want to think about how we manage that within the disciplines when we have associations which cross languages as well. So I think there's some interesting things I think we can take away as subject associations from that as well. Okay. Emanuelle, could I ask you to come in on this question as well, please?
Yes, I mean, I can only thank the colleagues for having brought up such great points. I can only echo in terms of EGI, one of the main things has to do, of course, with the precarity involved in the profession. But I also think it's important for us to remember, and perhaps there is a place there for subject associations, that modern languages, or basically that ableism is built into the languages and cultures of a field that works with languages and cultures. And perhaps there's a place there for subject associations to help us see, tackle, and dismantle ableism within our own institutions and within our own field, and enable us then to work with other colleagues and to see past biases in that sense, mainly when it comes to intellectual or non-visible or neurodivergency in that sense, because of course people don't necessarily know how to work with colleagues with disability what in modern languages, for example, we do have certain degrees of disabilities, and then I'm talking about students, but what happens in an oral exam if the student doesn't engage with people during their oral exam, looking at them in the eyes, and what does it do to their grade? Now, of course, that is a small little eye contact and how eye contact plays into modern languages assessment, so on and so forth, which is a different conversation. It's not the conversation we're having here. But what I'm saying is very few colleagues are willing to let go of the culture of having to have a person looking at your eyes for an assessment unless they have a reasonable adjustment plan and not penalizing them. So what kind of other equivalent behaviors do we have as a body of researchers that can further disadvantage our colleagues? And perhaps there is a place in subject associations there to help us there mediate that, see our own biases and educate us and help us in that sense by bringing specialists in order to talk to us. Finally, when it comes to the role of when it comes to Russell Group and non-Russell Group, look, I am at the University of Birmingham, and I was not aware of the fact that Austin has lost so much people in their language departments. I actually had a conversation with Emanuelle during the conference in Durham to see how we can work together. So I think there is a lot of insularity, and I work in a privileged university. But within this privileged university, we have so many pressures and we're blind and not looking at what's around. And I think Liz pointed out something very important. What about the kind of societal responsibility that we have as regions? Now, that is great. And I really think subject associations are there to help us remember that and help us embody that, because this is not necessarily the languages of administrators that want us to make whatever institution we're sitting in into the best, into the first, into the one on top. So the idea of collaboration and solidarity and working together is not necessarily going to come from our institutions, and it's not necessarily, we're not going to have work allocation model points in order to do that unless they have a really nice management. So perhaps there is a space for subject associations to pressure institutions to fulfill their societal roles by working together. And I see the Midlands for Cities, for example, in terms of postdoctoral training and funding, is really important to help us in the Midlands, to force us to work together in one way or another, because it does do the talk for the universities in that sense. So I definitely see that there is a space there for subject associations helping us by putting pressures in our institutions to allow us the space and the time to be doing that work.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that notion of collaboration and competitor is a really important one. Within the disciplines we're trying to collaborate, but from an institutional point of view, competition is more the watchword. Abir, you've got your hand up. Can I come to you?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you want to move on, but is it possible to just say a few points about disability, or would that be? Sure. I just want to say that, I mean, obviously the findings state that academics with disability, there is a huge gap, underrepresentation in modern languages, but this is a problem across higher education. However, in relation to modern languages, we know very, very little about the experiences of academics with different disabilities. What are the difficulties and barriers to language teaching, research, and career progression? So I am hoping that we can use this panel, this forum, to encourage associations and modern language associations and institutions to take a very proactive stance to encourage research on the lived experience of academics with disabilities in modern languages. I would also really, really hope that we might come out of this discussion with a recommendation to develop a national modern language network or program that would support academics with disabilities to overcome barriers, to support them in their careers, and overcome barriers to career progression. I really hope that this point can be taken up at some point, because unless we are proactive about this, I don't see how this can change.
Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you, Abir. I think there's some really good ideas that we might want to think about within the role of subject associations in developing mentoring schemes, supportive programs to support colleagues with disability as well, to make sure that everybody can fulfill their potential. Joe's asked in the chat whether UKRI has introduced narrative CVs. Does anybody know if they have or not? Charles?
Not to my knowledge, but one of the purposes of a discussion of this kind is, of course, that it is going to go straight to the AHRC. And Catherine Warren, Languages at AHRC, wanted to be here. She was going to be one of the respondents, but she, for various reasons, simply couldn't. But she's extremely interested to follow the discussion, the recording. And of course, we do intend to have a number of follow-up events from a discussion of this kind.
Thanks, Charles. We've touched a little bit on PhD students in the previous discussion, but it was something I did want to address explicitly. So we've got I think there's two really key points about PhD students coming out of Nicola's report, in terms of, first of all, the decline in the number of PhD students who are coming through, but also the relative decline in UK PhD students. So in the reports, there's only 53% of the PhD respondents had done their undergraduate work in the UK. So I wanted to just ask the panel what you felt the implications of the decline in PhD students coming into the discipline might be. Abir, could I start with you, please? Moving on to Emanuelle.
Well, for me, it's quite tragic, because it's the death of the discipline as a research discipline, really. So, and this is why we need to be very, very careful about this. And this is where I think challenge-led research might be useful as well, because we then are attentive to this issue. And if these sorts of applications are put forward, then we need to make sure that we build in support for funding, PhD funding, training for postgraduate students. So all of this needs to be embedded in these sorts of large-scale funding applications. And this is why challenge-led research funding is it's good to encourage it, because of the kind of support it can yield for early career scholars and PhD studies. Yes, I mean, we will become service departments. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute. I think that is a real risk, isn't it? And there are opportunities then within that challenge-led research. Emanuelle, could you come in on that question of PhD students? I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yes, I just wonder what is the whole idea of the international student fee and the international student being this revenue stream, really, and the importance that it has and the relevance that it has, whether it does have any impact on the fact that we have less home students taking these routes as well. Also, the fact that if we are, as an area, as a discipline, if we're not offering ways forward for careers for these people, right? For international students, it becomes more attractive, because once you finish your degree, the country kicks you out. So, you have to leave. I mean, you can have a visa up to 2 years to stay here, depending on the country you come from. But I wonder whether there is an aspect of the business model of modern languages and how we're funding the departments and so on, and what we're thinking, and whether it has some impact that actually makes universities less prone to invest in actually work on languages, work on the field as an academic field where everyone has to be part, and everyone, you said, I mean, like, whether the higher fee that we get and the student that goes away is kind of weighing on it. So perhaps there is a little scope for subject associations trying to find out a little bit more about what is going on that level, and understand why are these people not being accepted or not staying with us, the homegrown students.
Okay, thanks. And I guess that in some ways goes back to Naomi's earlier points around precarity and the possibility for different groups of people to access postgraduate research. Becky, can I come to you and then to Liam, please?
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, two thoughts really. The first, in terms of the shift away from UK students going through to PhD, I feel that is coming from MA level, that in our areas, most of our MA students, almost exclusively, are international students. I'm sure that's related, as Abir just said, to our HE funding model, all sorts of wider problems. I don't want to problematize the students themselves, who are fantastic, obviously, and a real rich source of ideas and expertise, and we're all learning from each other, and that's super positive. But if something is happening around MA study in our areas, that UK students either don't need an MA or are not in a position to do an MA, and obviously that has implications in terms of who's going to then go on and do a PhD. And then the other thing from the report that I found really interesting was the shift in areas of study. There was a comparison between what PhD students were studying and what people post-PhD were researching. And some were perhaps not surprising. There was a move towards gender and sexuality studies, which is important and exciting, a move towards visual arts, towards media, towards philosophy, religion, history of ideas. So I think those all sound like exciting moves. And then slightly mysterious ones that I don't quite understand, a move away from film and screen industries, and a move away from language teaching and pedagogy. And the second is especially of concern, because it would be fantastic to get more people coming through having done PhDs in language teaching, language education, language pedagogies, and having those come through in joining our department. So yeah, I don't know any more obviously than is in the report, but I found those numbers quite intriguing, and I don't feel that I understand what is behind some of those shifts. Yeah, and the one about language teaching and pedagogy, please can we somehow work out how to reverse it, because that doesn't feel right for what we need as a community. That's all from me on that one.
I think I would agree. I would agree with Becky about the pipeline from secondary education and research interest being research interest kind of starting very early on, actually, in secondary education, and the types of models that you take there in the UK system, which is very specialised. And I think perhaps, you know, this is a declining PhD students in languages is perhaps a side effect of calling ourselves languages and modern languages, because the types of skills that you imagine yourself to need or to acquire through a PhD in languages, what you come out of a PhD in languages is not a settled question, and it that can be a positive thing because we're such a diverse field. But I think perhaps it could also be putting people off that we are so diverse that people perhaps are not sure how will fit into the field. So again, a bit more continuous thinking about our identity and what we do is important to these questions.
Thanks, Liam. Can I just ask Nicola to come in on that, around those questions of how we understand how the PhD students are self-identifying in terms of their research compared with more established researchers?
Yeah, I was just busy half typing something into the chat. So yeah, that's good to say it. So I think on the point Becky was making, certainly it's interesting that you interpreted it as a decline or a change compared to researchers who are further on. I think in the particular case of teaching and pedagogy, I think it might just boil down to, research on teaching and pedagogy. It might boil down to the fact that some of the respondents who are in an academic post pick up that area of research by virtue of being in the job, and then they sort of add it to their areas of interest. So I'm not so sure that I would see it as a change, that there used to be more PhD students doing it than there are now. I think that might be an artifact of how how we constructed and gathered the data.
That makes so much sense. You're doing research on the thing you're doing in your day job, which is teaching languages.
Yeah. Was there another one? Oh, the other one was visual arts and film. I haven't really got an answer to that. Visual arts and screen industries. Yeah, I don't know how significant
visual arts have gone up and film have down. So maybe
it's that people are. I think it may be that film studies is starting to. Not my area. I wonder if film studies sounds like an old-fashioned term now, and so the next generation coming through are more likely to talk about screen studies or visual studies or something that has a kind of wider remit. And was there another half to that question, Liz?
I don't think so.
Okay,
no.
Great.
If I could just jump in very quickly, I think Liam said I agree with Becky, but I don't think I was talking about the pipeline from secondary. People talk about that a lot. I was talking about the pipeline from degree to masters. And I feel that that's a dropping off point for home students that I hadn't thought about until I read Nicola's report, and I wonder what's going on and if there's anything we can do about that.
I mean, I think Liam's right as well. I think we're losing it at every single point, that you have a smaller number of really able students coming into A-level who then don't go on to do it at languages and so on. So I think you're both completely right.
Yeah, we're losing from GCSE all the way up. Very depressing ways. Naomi, can I come to you on that question of PhD students before I hand back to Charles?
I think, the point about the masters, I do think we need to look at what the masters offer is in modern languages, and I don't think it is maybe as strong as it could be. One question. Also, things like 1+3 model funding that they do in kind of ESRC and places where they fund the masters and the PhD. But I want to touch on a different point. I think, I have made the point earlier about can we recruit PhD students to a very challenging market, and I think what we need to do is think again creatively about the PhD, and are there ways that we can recruit in an ethical way that is, keeping languages students, but also giving them options and making sure they're well positioned at the end of their PhD. And one thing I think, there's obviously things like collaborative doctor awards and collaborative doctoral partnerships, but there's also we don't do this. I don't know why we don't have joint honours PhDs. This is a particular bugbear of mine, but why don't have PhD students who are co-located in multiple departments? We're kind of looking at that, someone doesn't necessarily want to become a digital humanist. They quite like their language's identity, something I like. And so I get to be co-located now as a staff member. And can we have, and it could be, Becca, we do this with education departments as well. We have people who maybe have done a PGCE and then want to go back into research. And that could be a way we could have more pedagogy people. We could have people who are co-located between a modern languages department and an education department. And I think we could do it in different ways. So I think that then also gives that PhD student, we do want more people coming into languages, but it gives them at the end, 2 disciplines that they have options in. And can we just think of a way of making sure we offer a PhD that we think is valuable to them, but that we are really thinking about what their options are afterwards and keeping that as kind of as expansive as possible.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because we tend not to have, at least not in my institution, we tend not to have professional doctorates for people coming back into the discipline. So in the School of Social Sciences, you may have teachers or practitioners of healthcare coming back and doing a professional doctorate reflecting on their experiences, whereas we tend not to have that so much in terms of language teachers who might be reflecting on their disciplines. And I think one of the things that came out of the 3 reports, Nicola's and Michelle's and Emanuelle's, was around how are we responding to what the sector needs. And if we've got people who are in the sector who are coming back and writing PhDs, then they're telling us very directly in interesting ways. So I think that's a really interesting point that you've raised there. I am mindful of time, so thank you very much for all your responses to those questions, and I'll hand back to Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. What I thought we could do in the last 20 minutes or so is we could sort of collapse any questions if anyone wants to put their hand up, absolutely. And we could do that. We could just end by asking people what follow-up they'd like to see in an ideal world. The point of Nicola's very importantly put together a whole series of recommendations which are important for the community, they're important for subject associations, they're important for the AHRC. But we can't just leave them. They have to be, they won't happen unless you really go on about it. And you go on about it in a way that it carries people with you. So I think, do put, to everyone here, do put your hand up if you want to say anything or stress what you'd like to see happen. But as a way of concluding, and we'll come back to Nicola at the end, we'll just ask panel members if they were to take one or two things, what would they like to see happening? And I'm going to start with Becky.
Sorry, Charles, you caught me reading the chat to see if there's anything important I wanted to pick up, and then said, let's go to Becky. So I was reading the chat.
Okay, right. No. Becky, the question was simply, if you were to pick one thing that you would like to see change and really implemented, what would that be?
I guess the
two would be fine.
Yeah, two things that I picked up at the beginning that we have kept coming back to. One is again about opportunities for people at less well-resourced universities. And the other is this mysterious thing that I don't understand in terms of the division between European languages and non-European languages, and moving towards languages as a field, making sure signed languages are part of that, and of course languages from outside of Europe and inside of Europe. I expect Liam will have a different thought, because you've said a few times, haven't you, about the sort of dilution of identity in terms of talking about languages as a field. So I'd be interested to hear that too. And of course, as a community, we have to think about pros and cons of everything. But they're my two big points, I think. And the less well-resourced universities, making sure people have voices, contextual points, all of that is so important, and it is something that I hope we can do as a sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Becky. Absolutely, these are things massively to follow up. We certainly have a certain power to convene, which we will be using around all of these points. Just referring to the chat, Saskia's point, this will be going straight to the AHRC, and together with the chat, and about your point about anonymity is a very good one, and it will be referred totally to the AHRC. I think, Becky, you've set up Liam to go next.
Yeah, that made me think, have I been coming across as too much of a pessimist? But no, I completely understand that. And I suppose one of the points that I wanted to say is that we don't need to lament the fact that we are in a new situation as a field. But what I do think we need is for us as a field to be communicating our role models and successful projects and things in more direct way, and in ways that that everyone can kind of see. So, and I think that's something that's missing at the moment, which is why it perhaps feels, for me at least, that there's this kind of, that we're not quite there yet as understanding what we are. And the second thing that I would be really interested to see come out of this is a shift in culture where we reach out to each other more at a very early stage to develop networking opportunities for challenge-led research, engaging with policy and working with on research projects, perhaps with government or business. And I would like to see this start with senior colleagues reaching out to early and mid-career colleagues, rather than putting the onus on people who are just kind of postdoctoral.
Thank you, Liam. I think this is something that Liz might want to come in about as well, because I know this is very close to the heart of the UCML. And one of the things that I think, a question generally at the back of all this, there are a lot of very important points emerging from a survey of this kind. It's wonderful also to think that you read what Nicola and the other fellows have put together, that's one thing. But until you really discuss it in a forum such as this, not all of its implications concerning diversity, concerning inclusivity, concerning the general movement of the disciplinary area and how it responds to its pressures are evident to you. So I think this needs to be discussed not just here, but continually. One of the things that also emerges is you've got to get sector buy-in to this process. And that is not always easy at all sorts of levels. And I think one can say also at senior level. I think that there is a job of work to be done to say that not necessarily that we're following one particular line, quite the reverse, but we are aware of some of the major issues that are confronting the university sector and our own particular corner as well. So Liz, do you want to say anything about just making sure that we can connect the sector as much as possible?
Yeah, I was just writing in the chat, actually, thinking about what Liam said about how we make sure that early career academics, that postdocs feel supported. So I think it's also about not necessarily having the ideas, but actually supporting the really good work they're doing. So the early career academic SIG that Liam was leading at the time produced an excellent code of conduct for engaging early career academics, making sure they were properly supported with institutions. And I think that was really important work. But what we can do as subject associations is really push that within our own institutions to really emphasize the importance of that work and to kind of throw our weight behind those kinds of initiatives. So that I think, you know, a lot of the answers are given to us by early career academics, by postdocs, but what we need to do is to give them support and make sure those voices are heard in all of the right places. There is a role, I think, for connecting. The thing that's come out very strongly is connections, isn't it? It's connecting across institutions, connecting across career pathways, across where we are at different points in our career, and creating almost like a web, I think, to make sure that everybody is supported and enabled in those ways.
Thank you. Emanuelle.
Well, I'd just again like to thank Nicola and for this wonderful portrait of what research looks like in our field. That is absolutely great. One of the things that I would like to see coming out of this in any way that would be possible is something that will be, I think, complement this picture that this report gives us, is how can we understand the conditions under which we work at all levels. So in order for us to see whether is there anything that has to change in how we organize the labor in model languages to allow us to move the things around, to do the changes that I would like to see happening. Because every time I come out of my office and I discuss with colleagues, everyone is incredibly tired. Everyone is incredibly overworked. And that is across the board. I do have wonderful senior colleagues who, on top of trying to develop help develop their early career colleagues, are doing very senior positions to make sure that the university keep the door open, and they're also overworked. Who does the language teaching? What is that the language teaching is not showing so much as an area of research in model languages? Why would that be? Who teaches that language? Who is doing that work? What is the relationship between the research that we do and the recruitment of students in order to keep our programs going? Is this the funding model that we want to keep on going? Do we want to push for a change in terms of the funding model in order for us to continue doing the work that we do? Because if our work is that kind of, also how should we be keeping the international nature of our work, right? Is everything that we do to be made of use here in the UK directly? This idea, it can be very insidious, the applicability of research and how that is important, useful, and it should be at the forefront of everything we do because we do that with public money, right? But how that then can become way too insidious and actually kind of kill other ways of knowing the world. So these are the things I'd like to see discussions going forward, because I think they will give us a bit more of a concrete view of what the field is like and the conditions that people deal with, that I think will get me to understand much more of of that which Nicola managed to capture here in this wonderful study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emanuelle. I think it's all very well to have certain vision, like the recent Higher Education Policy Institute's report about where the humanities are going in terms of interdisciplinarity, in terms of public visibility, in terms of challenge-led research. All that's fine, but you need to understand the material conditions, working conditions, possibilities for engagement with that, if that is going to become the reality of the humanities. And I think that's something that we need to really think about and focus on. So Naomi, and then Abir, and then I'll ask Nicola to say a few concluding words about where we go with this.
Yeah, I think it might connect to Emanuelle's points here, because I'm going to pick up on the training. I think it's such a useful article, but particularly for someone who's thinking about what training we need to develop in the future for languages. But again, I think there's the article shows very clearly what are the areas people want training in, and I think that's very easy to respond to. But what is harder to respond to is the time pressures and the ability, particularly for people mid-career, to access that, but also Liam's point about ECRs, having that kind of embedded in maybe postdoc funding schemes. So I think, having funding schemes that really embed training, but having workload models, having institutions that value not just the publication of research, but actually, how you develop those skills to deliver that kind of research in new and emerging areas. So I think what I'd really like to see is kind of at all stages, that reflection on how we make sure the structures are there for people to be able to develop new skills, to develop new knowledge, to be able to engage with challenge-led research or other emerging areas. And also going back to the kind of collaboration model, also we really need to be pooling resources in training, because it's not just the time to do training, it's also the time for people to deliver training. We rely on the expertise of the community. And if people aren't able to do that, can we pool the resources across the institutions? The DTPs were mentioned earlier as a good thing, but they also excluded some institutions. And, one thing, the ILCS, we try to make training available to everyone, because some institutions actually have much better training than others. So I think really pooling those training resources and collaborating across institutions and providing training that is accessible to everyone, and how we bring together what we have. And then also, I think training, we should collaborate across the humanities as well. We should collaborate across institutions, but we should also think, particularly with things like digital, even if it's not, we have to pool the humanities as a whole is struggling, and we need to pool those cross-humanities training resources as well and see what we can develop across departments as well.
Thank you, Naomi. And I think that sort of cross the board thinking needs to be really very carefully worked out, both institutionally and in terms of larger disciplinary structures like the humanities. And there is a degree also in which one should be thinking about how does one make this easier with a more condensed model, what individual language subjects associations do and what they don't do, where one should be looking for the bigger picture, and really just trying to be very mindful of the resources and time that people have, given the urgency of all the questions that we've been addressing today. Abir.
Yes, just to add to what has been said, as I mentioned, I would like to for us to come out of this panel with subject associations and institutions committing to filling the gap in the underrepresentation of academics with disability in whatever way is possible. In terms of policy as well, Nicola makes a very important point, which is to make modern language scholars aware of the opportunities in engaging with policy. But I would also urge associations and institutes to also provide us with access to conversations with those engaged in policy, so that we get a sense of how we can engage with them. So, both sides of a kind of dialogic approach. And finally, I'd hope that there would be a kind of work in progress conference or some workshop to see where we are at different stages of what has been proposed today as a kind of follow-up activity to give us a sense of what has been difficult, what is achievable, but that would be just a kind of wishful thinking, perhaps.
Thank you so much, Abir. I mean, the emphasis on EDI issues in the report is extremely valuable and needs to be acted upon and thought about in every way, shape, and form. We will be certainly following up this thinking strategically with a number of events, generally fairly condensed, 2-hour seminars at what we think might be the best time for people to attend, and really picking up and following on points that people have made today, because they are many, varied, and all extremely important. I'm going to ask Liz, after Nicola has spoken, to conclude formally the event. So I'll stop by asking simply Nicola for a few reflections.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's very strange to sit here and listen to a large group of people discuss your work. So that is an absolute luxury, which I've not experienced before. And I'm very grateful to everyone for having taken the time and care to discuss it. And actually all those people who commented on earlier drafts as well, so that immediately having had this session, there are certain things that I wish even more that I had done slightly differently, and that's been very fruitful as well. But a thank you. I would also like to put on record, this is definitely a co-authored article. So Katie Harrison is our names are alphabetical. We absolutely did this as a joint project, and it would not exist without Katie as the postdoc on it. So just want that noted. I'm delighted that you're following up with the AHRC, Charles, and I was really pleased to see that one of the new funding calls is actually for first-time fundees who've not had funding previously. That looked like quite a positive response to one of our recommendations. So I'm hoping I've read that right when we get to see the detail. Yeah, I don't think it's for me to say what I think should happen as next steps, but I think, ILCS and UCML together clearly have things on their radar, and very happy to help in any way to keep this concrete and, maybe choose some of those recommendations and turn them into an action plan that can be checked back on a little bit later.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Liz.
Yeah, sorry, I still haven't got the hang of these two screens things. So when I'm writing notes in the one hand and then going back, I can't get it across. I've been writing down notes, thinking of what you said, Nicola, about things. How do we take this forward? So I think there are some very specific ideas that I want to take to UCML that we can do internally. So Liam will be part of those discussions as well. And I think there are also important things that we can do in collaboration with ICLS as well, how we take forward in positive and concrete actions the things that have been raised today. I think it just to thank everybody for their time. Nicola, it's an incredible report that you and Katie have put together, and I think in conjunction with Michelle's piece and Emanuelle's piece as well, I think they've made a really, really important contribution to the way we think about where our discipline is, and it's been really important to have the views of our panel as well. I think representing different elements we're a very diverse constituency in modern languages, and we can never represent everybody, but I think the more voices we have as part of these discussions, then the richer we become as a community. So I want to thank all of our panelists for coming today, Nicola for the report, Charles for and Kathy for the amount of work they did in organising this session, and thanks to everybody also for their time, because I think one of the things that came out really strongly from this report is time is one of the most precious resources we have within our field. So to have given up time to think about how we work together as a discipline is already quite an important thing to do. So we were due to finish at 4 o'clock, and on that note of about time, I think if we give you back 3 minutes now, then that's our gift to you to enjoy your weekend. And it's a really tough time in our discipline at the moment for lots of reasons, as Charles said. So I think it's important that we take time to look after ourselves as well. Charles, did you want to say anything to finish?
No, absolutely. Just to say thank you so much to everyone, and to say that as Wendy's put in the chat, we will be organising a series in the autumn. One of them is the whole issue of policy that we were going to talk about a little bit today if there had been time, but we will be talking about that in November. And of course, following that up, We will be talking about what one does with the ref, and there are a whole series of things that we have planned. And on the basis of what we talked about today, we will certainly be following that up. So thank you to our audience and to our panel, and to Nicola and Katie for this wonderful report that gives us so much to think about and to structure. Thank you very much.